London is a city built on movement. The constant shuffle of commuters pouring through underground stations, the tide of tourists drifting down Oxford Street, and the glow of smartphones lighting every face. But behind this endless motion, another current runs quietly through the capital, fast, invisible, and ruthless. It starts with a single moment. A young woman stands outside Oxford Circus, the Friday evening rush pressing in around her. She's pulling up directions on her phone when, in a blur of movement, it's gone. A hand she never saw, a face she never registered. 1 second she was connected to the world, the next she was cut off. Her phone vanished into the crowd, swallowed by the city's pulse. The thief was Sofian Hadar, a name now etched into London's growing list of professional phone snatchers. For him, this wasn't luck or impulse. It was a system, a business, an industry feeding on distraction. And he wasn't alone. Every year, 78,000 phones disappear on London streets, a staggering number worth more than £50 million on the black market. For most Londoners, the theft feels like bad luck, a personal misfortune. But for detectives watching the numbers, a darker picture emerges. This isn't random crime, it's an epidemic. The numbers don't lie. Statistically, in the time it takes for a tube train to rattle from one station to the next, another Londoner will lose their phone. One theft every 7 minutes. By the time you finish watching this video, another 6 devices will have vanished into the city's underground networks. For the victims, the theft cuts deeper than just losing a piece of technology. Phones carry identities, bank accounts, private photographs, access to work, and the thread of daily life. In a city that runs on contactless payments and digital connections, losing a phone is like losing a passport, a wallet, and a diary all at once. For the thieves, it's the perfect crime. High value, low effort, and almost no trace. At Oxford Circus that evening, Hadar melted back into the crowd, his prize secured. But his theft was only a single drop in a tidal wave washing across London. Every borough reported cases: Westminster, Camden, Hackney, Islington. Moped gangs snatching phones in daylight. Pickpockets brushing against commuters on the Jubilee line. Even organized crews targeting nightclubs where phones slipped easily from handbags and pockets. Police reports read like a drumbeat of loss. Victim had phone taken while walking home, no suspect seen. Moped suspects rode past, snatched phone from hand. Group surrounded victim at bus stop, phone missing afterwards. Line after line, the same story. A crisis hiding in plain sight. The true scale of London's phone theft problem is rarely seen, because it doesn't erupt in dramatic headlines. Unlike a violent robbery or a high-profile murder, these are small crimes, each one quietly reported, often forgotten. But collectively, they form an empire of theft, fueling a shadow economy stretching from street corners in London to overseas markets in Africa, Asia, and beyond. For the Met Police, the challenge was obvious. They weren't facing opportunists. They were facing networks. Behind every stolen phone was a chain: the thief, the handler, the reseller, the exporter. By the time a victim canceled their SIM card, their device was already on a plane. Yet in 2023, something shifted. For the first time in years, the Metropolitan Police decided to strike back. They launched targeted operations, undercover stings, and surveillance teams dedicated to dismantling the networks one link at a time. And it all began with names like Sofian Hadar. Because to stop an epidemic, you don't just track numbers. You find the people who treat theft as a career, and you break the chain where it begins. But as the police closed in, London's phone thieves adapted. Faster, bolder, more ruthless. A war was unfolding in the heart of the capital, invisible to the millions rushing through its streets. And while most Londoners thought a stolen phone was just bad luck, detectives knew the truth. This was organized crime hiding in plain sight. Crime in London rarely exists in isolation. What starts as a fleeting snatch on a busy street doesn't end there. 4 men like Zakaria Sanajki, known on the streets as Sajki, theft was only the first domino in a carefully constructed empire. Where the average Londoner saw a stolen phone as a simple misfortune, Sajki saw a commodity. To him, every iPhone, every Samsung, every stolen device was part of a chain, a product to be processed, laundered, and shipped just like cocaine or counterfeit cash. But Sajki's empire didn't need gun battles or border shootouts. His business thrived in silence, hidden in the gray spaces between London's alleys and the world's shipping lanes. At the center of this web was a cast of characters. Sajki, the organizer, who orchestrated the flow of phones from the hands of thieves to the docks. Ahmed Belhanafai, his close associate, known for handling logistics with military precision. And around them, dozens of smaller figures, runners, handlers, and opportunists, each playing their part in the quiet machinery of phone trafficking. Once a phone was snatched on Oxford Street or stolen from a commuter on the Victoria Line, it rarely stayed in London for long. The devices were funneled to safe houses, where handlers stripped them of SIM cards and prepared them for export. Signal-blocking foil wraps were used to keep phones alive and traceable only to a dead end. From there they moved in bulk, packed into crates of second-hand electronics, disguised inside containers of clothing, even hidden among car parts. On paper the shipments were harmless. In reality they were worth millions. The phones traveled further than their original owners ever had. Lagos, Accra, Dubai, Karachi. Detectives working these cases would later describe the trade as being as sophisticated and lucrative as drug trafficking. The difference? It carried far less risk. A stolen phone might resell for hundreds, multiplied by thousands of units, and if caught, the penalties were lenient compared to narcotics. To Sajki and his associates, this was perfect business. High profit, low danger. But statistics and supply chains mean little without the human cost. For London's victims, the impact was visceral. Take the story of a blind commuter traveling home from King's Cross. His phone wasn't just a gadget, it was his guide, his lifeline. When it was snatched from his hand, he was left stranded, disoriented, terrified. Or the surgeon whose phone contained medical records, patient notes, and direct contact with his hospital team. One theft meant hours of chaos, cancelled operations, and lives disrupted. Then there were the tourists, people who came to London chasing postcards and history, only to leave with police reports and lost memories. For them, the theft of a phone meant more than money. It meant vanished photos, maps, hotel details, all gone in seconds. Even members of parliament weren't spared. In one reported case, an MP's device was stolen outside Westminster, exposing just how brazen the networks had become. These weren't random stories. They were proof that Sajki's business wasn't faceless. Every stolen phone meant someone's life cracked open. By 2023, investigators piecing together the evidence began to see the structure. Sajki wasn't operating on instinct. He was running a shadow corporation. Street-level thieves like Sophie and Hadar supplied the raw product. Middlemen handlers processed the phones, cleaning, unlocking, and disguising them. Export teams managed the logistics, foil shielding, shipping manifests, containers marked as used electronics. Overseas partners turned the stolen goods back into cash, funneling profits back to London. It was a pyramid not unlike a cartel. But while drug lords needed to guard their empire with violence, Sajki's crew needed only secrecy and speed. For London's Metropolitan Police, the challenge was immense. You couldn't fight this trade with a few patrols or street arrests. Every link in the chain was designed to be disposable. Street thieves were caught and replaced within days. The real power lay higher, hidden in warehouses and offices, cloaked by paperwork that looked legitimate until someone started pulling threads. To the public it still seemed like petty crime. A phone gone here, a moped theft there. But inside police headquarters, the numbers told a different story. They were staring at a business generating tens of millions, a quiet empire thriving in the shadows of a global city. And so, for detectives, the question shifted. It was no longer just, who stole the phone, but who profits when it leaves the country? Because until Sajki and Belhanifai's network was dismantled, the thefts would never stop. By the end of that year, the Met would begin to unravel the operation piece by piece. But what they were about to discover went far beyond stolen phones. This was London's underworld at its most refined, organized, patient, and global. And like any empire built on greed, it was only a matter of time before cracks began to show. For years, London's phone theft crisis had been treated as background noise. A statistic buried in police reports, an inconvenience shrugged off by insurance companies. But by 2023, the sheer scale forced a shift in strategy. The Metropolitan Police realized they could no longer just respond after the fact. If they wanted to cut into the heart of the trade, they had to become hunters. It started quietly, with plainclothes officers blending into the city's busiest streets. Detectives swapped uniforms for hoodies, mingling with crowds at Oxford Circus, Leicester Square, and Camden High Street. Their job wasn't to stop thefts as they happened, but to watch, track, and follow stolen phones as they moved through the underworld. Technology became their most powerful ally. Every smartphone carries a digital fingerprint, its IMEI number, a unique identifier impossible to erase without sophisticated tools. For police, this meant that once a device was reported stolen, they could track it across networks, even across borders. Find My iPhone pings became the modern equivalent of a trail of footprints. A phone swiped outside Oxford Circus might suddenly light up in a Peckham flat. Hours later, it could be detected moving towards Heathrow. Detectives built digital maps of movements, layering them with CCTV and license plate recognition. Piece by piece, the invisible web of phone trafficking was revealed. The real breakthroughs came not from dramatic raids, but from patient observation. One turning point came when officers stopped a car driven by Adam Slater, with Tiana Phillips as a passenger. What looked like a routine traffic stop revealed a hidden cache of stolen devices, wrapped in foil to block signals. It was a snapshot of the logistics that investigators had long suspected. The phones weren't just being stolen, they were being systematically prepared for export. Then came Heathrow. Customs officers, tipped off by the Met, began scanning electronic shipments more carefully. Inside crates marked as used laptops, they found dozens of stolen iPhones, their IMEIs already flagged in police systems. Each interception provided more than just recovered property. It provided links, names, routes, and networks that tied the street-level thefts to the masterminds pulling strings. CCTV added another layer of evidence. From mopeds tearing through Soho to pickpockets working tube escalators, the footage created a living archive of the epidemic. But more importantly, it tied known suspects to specific thefts, making cases prosecutable in court. By early 2025, the investigation reached a breaking point. For the first time, the Met moved not just to disrupt, but to crush. In February 2025, a citywide crackdown shook the networks. Over the course of 1 week, coordinated raids swept through London. Safe houses were stormed, warehouses searched, and handlers arrested. By the end of the operation, police had recovered more than 1,000 stolen phones and made 230 arrests. The figures sent shockwaves through the media. But inside the Met, the numbers meant something deeper. Proof that the strategy was working. For the first time, the chain had been broken in multiple places at once. Crucially, the police weren't acting alone. Partnerships with tech companies turned the fight into a joint offensive. Apple worked closely with investigators, strengthening its activation lock and improving Find My iPhone tracking, making it harder for stolen devices to be resold. Google introduced similar theft deterrent features, allowing Android phones to be locked down remotely, effectively turning them into useless bricks in the hands of traffickers. This collaboration wasn't just about technology, it was about credibility. By showing that billion-dollar tech firms were standing alongside law enforcement, the Met signaled to the public that this wasn't petty crime anymore. It was organized theft, and it was being treated as such. But perhaps the most important development was what detectives were building behind the scenes. Cases against the ringleaders. Every recovered phone carried data. Its IMEI linked back to its rightful owner, but also forward, to the handler who touched it, to the reseller who logged it, to the shipment that carried it. Investigators painstakingly mapped thousands of devices, connecting dots that had once seemed invisible. The goal was no longer just to catch the thieves on mopeds. It was to dismantle the pyramid from the top down. To prove in court that men like Sajki and Belhanafi weren't petty criminals, but leaders of an organized criminal network with international reach. For Londoners, the February crackdown was a headline, a reassurance that something was finally being done. But for detectives in the Met's task force, it was only the beginning. Because they knew that behind every arrested handler, another was waiting. Behind every intercepted shipment, another container was already moving. The challenge wasn't stopping thefts for a week. The challenge was to turn tactical victories into a strategic war that London could finally win. And in the months that followed, the battle would shift again, from the streets and shipping lanes to the courtrooms of London. Because for Sajki, Belhanafi, and their associates, the days of operating in shadows were running out. Their empire had been mapped, their phones traced, and their profits exposed. The question was no longer whether they were guilty. The question was how much of their empire could be brought down in public before the rest adapted and moved on. By the time the case reached trial, London's phone theft epidemic was no longer invisible. The raids, the headlines, the thousands of devices recovered, all of it had built towards a reckoning. And in December 2024 at Isleworth Crown Court, that reckoning arrived. Inside the wood-paneled courtroom, the key figures of the network finally stood before a judge. Zakaria Sajki Sanajki, once the quiet orchestrator of a multi-million-pound empire, faced the stark reality of prison walls. At his side, Ahmed Belhanafi, the meticulous lieutenant who had managed the movement of phones from London streets to overseas markets. Around them, a cluster of handlers and street-level thieves, each awaiting their fate. The sentences reflected the pyramid structure of the crime itself. Sajki, as ringleader, received 8 years in prison. Belhanafi was handed 4 years and 8 months. The higher the rung, the heavier the punishment. Those caught at street level, the pickpockets, the moped riders, faced shorter custodial terms, some as little as 18 months. Others were given community orders, their roles judged as replaceable, their crimes petty when seen in isolation. But prosecutors were determined to ensure the court saw the bigger picture. In his summation, the Crown's barrister described the operation as industrial-scale theft. Not random street crime, but an organized business that undermined public safety. He reminded the court that while the defendants hadn't wielded knives or guns, the damage was no less corrosive. Thousands of Londoners had been stripped of their digital identities, their safety, and in some cases their ability to work or travel. The irony was unavoidable. For years, Sajki's network had thrived precisely because phone theft seemed safe. No blood spilled, no violent headlines, just the quiet removal of devices from pockets and hands. It was this absence of overt violence that kept the trade low on the list of public priorities. But in the end, it was that same invisibility that became their undoing. Because while phones can vanish into crowds, their signals cannot vanish from the air. The pings, the emails, the digital fingerprints, all of them betrayed the networks. The very thing that made smartphones valuable was what allowed the police to follow them back to the source. When the sentences were handed down, there was no applause, no cheering. Just a quiet recognition that one chapter of the crisis had closed. Sajki and Belhanafi were led away, their empire dismantled, their profits seized. But for detectives watching from the gallery, the victory felt tempered. Because they knew London's phone theft problem hadn't ended. The epidemic still lingered in 4 key hotspots: Westminster, Camden, Hackney, and Islington. These boroughs remained magnets for thieves, where tourists and commuters alike walked with devices exposed, unaware of the eyes watching them. Every statistic reminded the city that while one network had fallen, others would rise. One phone stolen every 7 minutes. A reminder that the battle was ongoing, and that London streets remained both vibrant and vulnerable. London's phone theft epidemic is more than just a story of stolen devices. It's a story about how organized crime evolves in plain sight, hiding behind what looks like petty theft. It's about the men who built empires from stolen handsets, the detectives who followed invisible signals, and the courts that finally tore the networks apart. But most of all, it's a reminder. In a city where every face is lit by a phone screen, no one notices how quickly the shadows move. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We uncover the hidden empires behind everyday crimes. The networks you don't see, the stories that slip beneath the headlines. Hit the bell so you never miss an episode, and drop a comment below. Do you think London can ever beat this epidemic, or will another network rise to take its place? Because in this city, the story is never truly over.